God taking care of us, and really trusting in God more than anything else. And Houston, where did Houston go? Could you see if you can find my little clicker? Because it's not up here anymore. So maybe in the sound room. So we're in Daniel chapter 10. We're continuing to look at Daniel chapter 10, verse 12. I'd show you this on the screen, but I don't have my clicker. Right? And he says, you got it for me? It says, then he said to me, fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. You know, there's something kind of unique about a situation where God would look at someone and say, look, because you set your heart to gain understanding, your words have been heard, and this statement, I have come in response to them, is an angel. So wouldn't you like to have a situation where you knew that you set your heart to gain understanding, you humbled yourself before God, so that when you prayed, then God would send an angel to bring an answer to your prayer. So that's kind of what we're looking at, and I think it still happens, all right? I think God will still send angels to work with us, to help us through life. It's God's messengers. They are God's protection in our world. So what does it mean if you humble yourselves? You know, so we think about New Testament verses. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that He may lift you up in due time. Or a verse in James, humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will lift you up. And so if you've been here the last couple of weeks, you know, man, at the end of the lesson we sing, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, right? And just so you know, so that you don't think, man, Houston is picking out the same song every time. I'm telling Houston every week to pick out that song, because at the end of the lesson for the next few weeks, I want you to think in terms of what does it mean to humble ourselves before God? If we humble ourselves under God, what does that mean? Now, we used this slide last week, but I think it's really important, and we've got to start there, and we'll do this again next week, okay? So you can memorize this slide. It's going to keep showing up. Want to is more important than how to. So many times we think about how we're supposed to do something, and the question is not really about the how. The question is really about the desire of the heart. What does our heart want? What does our heart desire? Remember the first part of that verse, he said, you set your heart to do something. So what is your heart set on? Is your heart set to humble yourself before God? So what does it mean to humble yourself? I mean, you read that and say, okay, I'm going to do like Daniel. I'm going to humble myself before God. So what does that mean? What is Daniel talking about? Well, it kind of highlights something that Daniel said earlier in the chapter. Daniel has gotten this vision from God. And he says, at that time, I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used no lotions at all until the 3 weeks were over. So that's part of what Daniel means by humbling himself, or what God means by telling Daniel to humble himself. The message of God became so important that other things in life took a secondary stance. Now, I don't know if you've ever been there with something that was going on in your life. Maybe you were in the hospital in a waiting room, and somebody that you loved, somebody that you knew was in the hospital. Maybe they'd had an accident. Maybe they had a disease. Maybe they had a heart attack. Maybe they had a stroke. And it's not unusual for you to go in and talk to a family member at that time, and one question we ask is have you eaten anything? And many times, what's the response that you get? No. Why have they not eaten anything? It's because they are so consumed with what's happening. They're so worried. They're so concerned, so upset, that they just don't think to eat. Something else has their attention so greatly that all of a sudden food becomes something they're not even really thinking about. If you ever had a situation in life where you're trying to make a decision, maybe life isn't working out quite the way that you want it to, or maybe life is working out exactly the way that you want it to, and God has placed this opportunity in front of you, and you're not sure if it's God's opportunity or an opportunity from somewhere else, and you're really weighing your life, and you're trying to figure out, in this particular situation, what is the right decision? What should I do? Is God leading me in a particular way? And you become so consumed with that that all of a sudden you will find yourself, radio that you used to listen to, you're not listening to the radio anymore because during those times you're talking to God about this decision that you have. Or you might go for a period of time and you might not eat because you're thinking about this decision is weighing on your mind so much that everything else just kind of falls to the background. All of a sudden, all of those things that used to be important really aren't that important anymore. And so when Daniel is in this time of life, I think that's exactly what's happening to him. I think that's what it means by Daniel humbled himself. Now that word humble is a really unique kind of word. It's and I don't want to take you down some big word study, so I want to take you down a little word study, okay? So it has several meanings. It means to oppress or to humiliate or to afflict. It means to be troubled. It can mean in some context to submit. It could mean in some context to bow down. And the interesting thing is when it's used in Daniel chapter 10, verse 12, the emphasis of the word is it's something that Daniel has done to himself. It's kind of a reflexive, intensive. He's really done this particular thing. What does it mean? He oppressed himself, that he humiliated himself, that he afflicted himself? Well, in some ways, because he didn't have any choice food, right? And no wine touched his lips. He didn't eat any meat. So that could have been something that was somewhat intentional. Did he submit to God? Is that what Daniel's talking about? Yeah, so it's kind of got that meaning too. He submitted himself to God. To bow down? Yeah, he bowed down before God. He's looking to God for answers. Is he troubled? Yeah, he's troubled. I mean, he's really worried about this message that God has given him, and he's trying to figure out what does the message mean. So he's troubled about that, trying to figure it out. So even though it has nuances of meanings, they're kind of all tied up into that same meaning. And so a lot of times in the Old Testament, we will translate it either to deny yourself, and sometimes we'll translate it to fast. For example, in Leviticus chapter 16, it's talking about the Day of Atonement. And it says, this is to be a lasting ordinance for you. On the 10th day of the 7th month, you must deny yourselves, and that's the word that we translate humiliate in Daniel chapter 10. You must deny yourselves and not do any work. And so, I think I put another verse up here. It's the Sabbath day of rest, and you must deny yourselves. It is a lasting ordinance. And so what does it mean in that context to mean that they denied themselves? Well, one of the first things we think about is, the Day of Atonement, they fasted. They didn't eat, right? Well, there's a word for fasting in the Hebrew text, and there's a word for humiliation or denying yourself. And he didn't use the word for fasting here. He used the word to humiliate, to deny yourself. So would it include food? Yeah, most likely, yes. Could it include other things? Yeah, it could. It doesn't have to be restrictive to food. So on that particular day, what they are supposed to do, that Day of Atonement, which is the only day that's specifically commanded in the Old Testament to deny yourself or to humiliate yourself, you're supposed to take that day, and every part of that day is supposed to be focused on God. You deny yourself, whether it's food or something else. Now, Isaiah comes along. I think it's and he kind of combines the two. He says, why have we fasted, they say, and why have you not seen it? And why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please, and you exploit all your workers. Now, this is what I need you to understand this. Remember when I put up there a few minutes ago that want to is more important than how to? Were they fasting? Y'all can answer, by the way. This is not just has to be one. Y'all can say yes. Y'all, whatever. Were they fasting? Oh, yeah, they were fasting. They go without food? What? Sounds like they went without food. How did that impress God? Not so much, right? Was God impressed that they were fasting? No. He's not impressed that they just did a thing. Because their heart wasn't in the thing. Y'all do you're fasting, you do as you please. You're not really doing that to please me. You're not doing it to set your heart to me. You're not doing it to think about the way that you can honor me in the world. You're just doing whatever you want, and you're just going without eating for a little while. Is that what God wants? No. Remember in the Old Testament, he would do those verses about, you give your sacrifices, but I despise them. I despise them. I just detest them. You think, well, why would God detest sacrifices? Because they're not done with the right heart. They're not really humbling themselves before God. There's just some kind of outward action. So if you leave here and you say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to have a day that I'm just not going to eat. Well, unless that has a purpose, unless you're really trying to humble yourself before God, God's not very impressed with that. It's not the action, it's the heart that God is impressed with. So it could be kind of denying food, and you kind of look at that. I think what is really important with this passage is to humble yourself in this passage meant seeking God's direction with intense passion. Daniel's just not casually saying, you know, I wonder what kind of message God's given to me. I wonder what God's trying to tell me. He's just not casually saying, I wonder what the plight of God's people is going to be in the future. It's not casual conversation here. This is serious stuff for Daniel. He is denying himself. He's not eating any choice foods. No wine is touching his lips. He's not eating any meat. He is so consumed by this message that is supposed to come from God that he truly just humbles himself before God. He is looking to God for any kind of answer. He knows that he can't interpret it. He knows that he can't study it enough to find the meaning. He is looking for this message that comes from God, and everything outside of that takes a secondary place. It's not just a casual question. It's not just that he offers a prayer, but he offers this prayer with such passion, and he unites fasting or whatever it is with it. However, he denied himself. And some of that was probably food. You know, when you really start to think about it, desire is more important than method, right? Desire is more important to method. Because you start looking at him and you start thinking, okay, what are some practical ways your desire to hear God's message takes priority over normal life? That's a tough question. I mean, that's a really tough question. So you're going through life, and we got all of the stuff that goes on in life, right? And so I don't know what your schedule like, but my schedule is I get up and I come to the office and I get a little bit of studying done, and then the phone rings, and I don't know what's happening after that. It just, day goes wherever the day goes. Can you get so busy doing whatever you're doing, even if it's really good stuff? I mean, even if it's really good stuff, and you get so busy doing all the little things that you have to do, all the little things to get through your day, that all of a sudden you find yourself at the end of the day, and you really haven't sought God at all during that day. And I know what you say, because I used to say the same thing. Man, I don't have time, right? I don't have time. And no, there are practical ways that we can do that. So you say, well, Greg, you're a preacher, and so that's all you're supposed to do, right? You're not supposed to have time for anything else. Well, I wish that were true sometime. So let's revert back to when I had a job that wasn't preaching. So let's revert back to when I had a sales job. So, and I don't think my life at that time would look much different than what your life looks like. So this is what I remember, and Diane can either nod or give me a no, that's not the way it worked, or she might have to come over here and tell you herself exactly the way things work. But here's what I remember. We had to get the boys to school, so we get up early in the morning, right? And you got to feed them breakfast before you send them to school. So you get them up, you feed them breakfast, you take them and you drop them off early because you went to early care, right? So we drop them off early, and so we dropped them off like 7. Okay, got a nod. I'm doing it right. So about 7, we drop them off. We go from there to the office, do paperwork at the office. I was in sales at the time. Then you got client calls all day, sales calls all day, putting out fires all day, all the stuff that all of y'all do every day, right? And so then you go back, the boys go to the after-school care because we can't get there at that time school's out to pick them up, so they have to stay till the work day's over. So then we pick them up from aftercare around 5, and then we go home, and then I think first we ate. We ate dinner first, then we did homework, you know, and then we had a little time that wasn't homework. Had to get a video game in there, right, Houston? Had to get a little video game in there, and then we have to give them a bath, and you give them a bath, and then you have to get them to bed, and then they don't want to go to sleep, like no kid wants to go to sleep. So then by the time you work your way through and finally get them asleep, you're tired, and then you go to sleep, and it's like You get up the next day and you do it all over again. Any of y'all ever feel like that? Okay, even retired people feel like that. It's like, what do y'all got to do with that? Y'all supposed to be retired. Yeah, so you got that going on. And it's like, okay, here's the question. Where in normal life do you find God? Where do you find time for that? Say, well, I don't know. I don't know. Well, maybe there's some practical times to do that. Maybe instead of listening to the radio, maybe you talk to God while you're driving, eyes open. Maybe instead of lunch one day, maybe you go find a quiet place and you just sit and talk with God. I'm not saying every day, but occasionally. What if you can find a little bit of time in the morning? What if, I know it's not ideal and it's not perfect, but what if you got up 15 minutes earlier? Or what if you stayed up 15 minutes later? I'm not telling you how to do it or where to do it. And it's not about method. Remember, it's about your heart. In your heart, are you searching for God, listening to His message? Because the opposite of humility is pride. And we have to be really careful in our world. Because in our world, instead of pride being a sin, instead of pride being something that causes somebody's downfall, if we're not really careful and we follow the way of our world, in our world, pride is something that we put on a pedestal. And all of a sudden, you look at pride and you look at people who are famous or rich, or they don't even have to be any of those things. Even religious leaders. And all of a sudden, how other people view us and what other people think about us becomes more important than our relationship with God. Or we become boastful and self-centered and prideful because we think that we know all the answers. I started to write down some of the, and by the way, I think pride is probably the worst of, I think it's kind of like the center of all the other vices. And you think, well, how does that represent itself? I wrote some things down. This is just my thoughts. Pride centers the universe on you. And I think that's true. I think somebody who's really prideful, they think the whole world revolves around them. Y'all have never said that about anybody, have you? You're sitting talking to somebody and you're talking with somebody and you're talking about somebody else and saying, well, they think the whole world revolves around them. That's what we say. And that's an issue of pride, because the whole world doesn't revolve around me. It kind of causes us to think we know more than we really think. And it causes us to think that we have all of the right answers, even though we might not have all of the right answers. And it also causes us not to question the answer that we currently have, because we think we're right. No matter what anybody else says, we think we're right. And that's part of an issue of pride. Pride makes us think that we're the exception. Have you ever heard this? You'll be talking to somebody and say, well, I know that happens to most people, but it's not going to happen to me. Well, no, typically it's going to. We're really not the exception to the rule. And I don't want to burst your bubble or anything, but most everybody thinks they're the exception to the rule. But we're not the exception to the rule. You know, the world doesn't revolve around me. I don't have all of the answers. I'm not the smartest person who ever walked on the planet. Everything doesn't have to be exactly the way that I want to have it. But we all have our opinions, don't we? And what happens with pride and humility, much like where Daniel was, we look at life and we ask, what are some areas you struggle to really give God control? I mean, what are areas you really struggle to give God control? That you think that the way that you want to do it, whatever God thinks, you think that your way of doing it is probably better than His way of doing it. And I know we look and we smile and we say, well, no, this is church. You're not supposed to have any of those. I know we're not supposed to, but the reality is we do. And we have to step back from that and we say, okay, God, what is it that you want for me in my life? What is it? What direction are you trying to take me? I don't mean by that every decision you have in life, God's going to give you a clear-cut answer. Because some things you have decisions about, and whichever decision you make is the right decision. There's not just one right answer. I get a lot of grief in my life because I wear black shirts. It's just what I do. And I ran into somebody the other day and they said, well, I didn't recognize you. You weren't wearing black. And I said, well, that's just really funny, right? Now, most of you who know me know, why do I wear black? It's okay, you can say it. What? I can't hear anything anybody's saying. I had to come in hearing aids because I thought they was messing up. So, what? It matches everything. You can wear it with anything except navy blue and brown. Right? Is that right, babe? Okay. So, I have to ask to make sure I'm right. But you can wear, I don't have to mix and match and try to figure out what goes with what. It's like, you can wear black with it, just no navy blue. Blue jeans are different, but no navy blue and no brown. And then you're good to go. Because my taste is not very good. And it's okay. I married taste. I don't have it intrinsically. All right. So that's one of the reasons I wear black. What's the other reason I wear black? Huh? Oh, it's slimming. Oh, I didn't know that, but woo! Thank you. Right. I'm digging slimming. Yeah, I didn't know that. Maybe that's why Diane likes it, because it's slimming. But that's the other reason I wear it, right? She said, I think you look good in black. I was like, okay, it's only one woman in the world I have to please. If she tells me to wear black, I wear black. That's good advice for any of you who are married or going to get married, right? There's only one woman in the world you have to please. Make whatever she says go. Let's go. Just don't even argue with it. If she says wear polka dots, just wear polka dots. Don't worry about it. As long as it looks good to her. And you laugh about things like that, but then you look at life and you say, man, there's some areas that I really struggle to give God control. And what are those for you? Because what really happens with humility is humility requires us to have a right view of ourselves in relationship to God. It doesn't mean that you're not important. You are important. You're important to God. It doesn't mean that you have to beat yourself up all the time. You know, you have to balance humility and it doesn't mean that you always go around thinking bad of yourself, because you balance that with the fact that God loves you and that you're somebody who's important because God thinks you're important. And you balance those things out. There's a lot of self-worth we have because of our relationship with God. I'm not telling you not to have any self-worth. But what it does mean is that we have this right view of ourselves in relation to God. The wisdom of God is greater than my wisdom. I don't want to hurt y'all's feelings. I mean, I know you're a preacher and all that kind of stuff. I'm just telling you up front, I'm not nearly as smart as God is. Okay? We can all agree on that, can't we? Charlie's just nodding his head. Yeah, I'm not nearly as smart as God. Does God have a better plan than me? Whatever my plan is. Okay, let's just say my plan is it is a wonderful plan. I mean, I've scoped this thing out. I know exactly what's supposed to happen in life. Is God's plan, whatever that is, better than my plan? Yes. Yes. Now, do I always know what it is? No. No. Sometimes God has to come along, kind of push me in the right direction. But humility means that I trust God to do the things that God says that He will do. And that's where my humility comes from. It's where your humility comes from. And it's where Daniel's humility came from. Whatever message God had, Daniel knew that God had the answer to the message. And whatever God chose to do was the right thing to happen. You know, you see that reflected in Scripture in several different ways. One of them is give us this day our daily bread. Why did Jesus pray that? What is that all about? Give us today our daily bread. And I know we go through the American answer. And then here's the American answer. Well, they didn't have refrigerators. And so since they didn't have refrigerators, they weren't able to keep it from one day to the next. So, you know, they needed tomorrow to go buy what they needed to eat that night. Partially true. But you had things like flour. You could have more flour than a day's worth. Couldn't you? So what does God mean? What did Jesus mean? Give us today our daily bread. He meant that you trust in God each day for the thing that you're going to need. And God will provide it. Now, He's not necessarily going to provide what you want. He's going to provide what you need. Does that mean you'll never go a day hungry? Is that what Jesus said? Did Jesus by that say, and by the way, you'll never go a day hungry? That wasn't in there, was it? Doesn't mean that. But it means God can provide the things that you need. Trust God to do the things that God will do. And here's a big part of humility. Listen, don't tell. Don't tell God what He needs to do. Have you all had prayers like that? I mean, you can nod your head because I've had them too. Have you ever had prayers where at the end of the prayer you think, man, I just gave God like a whole grocery list? Right? I mean, I just said, now God, I got this life thing figured out, and I need you to do this, and this. And I just give God just kind of a big grocery list of things to do. It's like I put a quarter in, and I push the prayer button, and the answer pops out, and everything's good. That's not the way it works, is it? Because what will happen in that, there are things that God knows that I need that I don't know that I need, and things that I think I need, and God knows that's the very last thing that I need in my life. There are times where I'm convinced, God, you need to do this thing, and I am just convinced, and I pray for weeks and weeks about it because I know exactly what God needs to do, and God is up there saying, no, that's not what I need to do, and I'm not going to do that for you. And I'm down here saying, God, why haven't you done the thing that I'm asking you to do? And God's just sitting there and He's smiling and He's saying, because as bad as you think that's the right thing to do, that is not the right answer. And humility means that I am willing to listen to God and to let God lead and to not think that I have all the answers. And so you see Daniel. He's gotten this message from God that he can't understand. He can't interpret it. He knows it's about the plight of his people. And the interesting thing about Daniel 10 is Daniel 10 doesn't even tell us what the vision is. It just says that Daniel got it. That's going to tell us the interpretation in the last part of the chapter. But as Daniel wrestles with that, the only way he knows to get direction from God is to set his heart to gain understanding and to humble himself before God. To understand that God's in control. So we look at life, and that's just kind of the question for us. And it's not a difficult question to ask, it's just a difficult question to answer. Do you really believe that God is in control? Do you really believe that what God does in your life is a thing that needs to be done in your life? Are you really willing to submit to the things that God has for your future? Can you really humble yourself before God? Can you recognize Him as being the supreme being and you're His servant? And in James chapter 1, can you humble yourself before God? Whether you want to call it humiliate or humble or deny, can you do that? Can you let God be God and you just be you? Because here's the promise. If you will humble yourself before God under His mighty hand, He will lift you up. And then the power and the strength doesn't come from you. It's never going to come from you. It's going to come from the God that you serve. So is this the first day? Remember the angel? From the first day, you set your heart to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God. Your words have been heard, and I have come in response to them. So can today be the first day you set your heart to gain understanding, to humble yourself before your God, to ask your God for help, and to let His angel come and help you? Is today the day you can humble yourself? If you need to respond in some way, I'm going to ask you to do that while we stand and sing.